I was talking with somebody who works in marketing at one of the big podcast networks, and they told me they basically canceled all ad spend on listener acquisition.
Oh,
And the
wow.
reason was that it just didn't work. To me, this is always the first thing I say is like, hey, you're like trying to worry about paid advertising and all this stuff. We have all this attention in your ecosystem. This is the low-hanging fruit here. So, Justin, I was doing some snooping around your Twitter profile the other day, and I came across this tweet from, let's see here, August 6th, 2021. And I want to run it by you and see how well it has aged. Does that sound good?
Sure, sounds great. I'm scared, but roast my tweets.
Here's the tweet.
Let's go.
People keep talking about podcasting's, quote, discoverability problem. But the people I know who listen to podcasts regularly seem to have no problems in finding new shows to listen to. If anything, they have the opposite problem. Too many good shows to listen to. So this is a topic, the podcasting's discoverability problem, which has been debated to death.
Yeah.
And here you're kind of calling it out and saying, no, this isn't actually a problem. How do you feel? Do you stand by this statement back from August 6th, 2021?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there is more nuance to it than that, but I think overall, the discoverability problem in podcasting is overblown. Most of the people who want more discoverability are venture capitalists who want to capitalize on podcasting. And even if you look at, for example, Netflix is a $250 billion technology company. They have thousands of engineers on staff who have perfectly tuned their algorithm for discoverability. And even they have a hard time promoting their new shows to the public. Like, they've got one of the biggest search engines in the world and lots of traffic. And even they have a hard time getting the word out. And even then, you'll still, even with this perfect discoverability platform, you'll still see people on social media asking for recommendations for what Netflix show they should watch next. And you see this with everything, Audible, another amazing audio search engine. And on social media, people are like, hey, I need some more audiobooks to listen to. On one hand, sure, I think we would like more people to be able to discover our podcasts. And we'd like more marketing channels that work for that. This is not just a problem that's unique to podcasting. Everyone is having a hard time with marketing channels and finding marketing channels that work and, getting the word out about their show, getting more people to try it out.
Yeah, I think about this a lot, and it makes me think, there have been businesses for thousands of years, and it's only really been in the last 10, 15. I think when most people think about discoverability, they're thinking about algorithmic discoverability. And this is such a new invention that people have been creating art and content and products and services and businesses for thousands of years without any automated discoverability, and they have still found a way to get that in front of the people who care about it. And so I think a lot of times when we think like, oh, there's no discoverability in podcasting, it's like, yeah, that's actually normal. It's an anomaly that recently there have been a few platforms that have actually facilitated that. And to some extent, yeah, that would be nice for us as creators to have that. But I think that what history shows us is that people have always found a way to get their work in front of people, and that we can certainly do the same. And so that's really what we're going to be digging into in this week's episode here, of looking at, what are some of the ways that you can get your show out in front of people. And I know last week we talked about social media in depth, so we're not going to go too much into depth there, but we also hinted that you don't actually need to be on social media, and that there are plenty of other kind of discovery channels out there that we can implement and leverage as creators.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about other ways people can promote the show. First, though, I'm curious, what did the survey show in terms of what works and doesn't for podcast growth?
Yeah, so there were some trends that I'll talk through in a second related to high growth shows, which were those that grew by 100% or more per year. So obviously those are the ones that we think like, okay, we want to be like those shows. But the one that made me kind of chuckle was one of the questions that I asked was, what has been most effective for you over the past year? And it was kind of a multiple choice list of marketing channels, and what has been least effective. And the fascinating thing, both the highest rated, most effective and least effective was social media. And so there was plenty of people who said social media was the most effective thing I did. And there was plenty of people who said social media was the least effective thing I did.
Classic.
And what you see is like every single category of every channel, there were people who said this was the least effective thing I did, and people said it was the most. And so that to me, I think kind of speaks again to this thing that we talked about in one of the previous episodes about how there really is no silver bullet, and that a lot of times it's doing the thing well that will work. And so it's like picking something that you can be good at, you can learn the ropes of, and then doing that well, and that will work for you.
Yeah, I love this question just because you realize that it's all over the map. So for some people, collaborations are working. For others, it's not. Some people, YouTube's working. Others, it's not. So,
yeah.
And what were some of these other trends? Like high growth shows, are they doing anything different than negative growth shows?
So one of the things we saw here with high growth shows, they were significantly more likely to utilize pitching podcast apps, which I thought that was actually interesting. And to me, that it seems to align with my anecdotal experience, where I would say that a lot of the people who are pitching podcast apps are generally, I don't want to say this in a kind of like pejorative way, but they're savvier. Like I think they've been in podcasting longer. They understand the ecosystem. They might have relationships with people at those platforms, and they kind of get how the game is played. And so I think a lot of times those people, like, they may be high growth for a number of reasons, and it's their savviness of how podcasting works that they can find these opportunities to get their show featured. They know how to do an effective pitch.
Okay, and just to pause there, when you say submit to podcasting apps, you mean like
Apple,
like you submit
Spotify,
to Apple Podcasts?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And each of these platforms generally has like an editorial review process. There's a form you fill out.
Yes.
If you Google, submit to Apple Podcasts featured, it will lead you to a form where you can then submit your show for consideration.
Yeah, and there are other apps as well. Apple and Spotify are the big two, but people have listed other apps. I think Pocket Cast might do this now as well. There's a few others. So there are directories where you can do that, and they actually invite submissions. And really what they're looking for is shows, either shows as a whole or episodes that have some kind of significant relevance in and of the moment. So in your pitch, you want to kind of tie it into something that's happening now in the world, that you can say, hey, I actually have a show on this, and this person, a lot of times if like a celebrity passes away, and you're able to say, actually, we just did this great in-depth kind of bio on them 2 weeks ago or something like that, and it feels really relevant. That would be an example of a good kind of pitch to one of these apps.
Oh, that's a good tip. I like that.
So a couple of the other things here, high growth shows were also more likely to implement paid advertising. This could be because they are more successful, have more of a budget, something like that. We don't really know. There is some correlation, might not be causation. We're going to talk more about paid advertising in depth in this episode. And they were moderately more likely than other shows to be writing newsletters, be on YouTube, and also blogging. And so I thought this was really interesting. The writing component here came into play.
Yeah.
And I have some suspicions about this, but those were some of the trends that stuck out from the highest growth shows.
When I look at this data, to me, it just seems like any channel can work.
Yep.
And it just depends on your context, your audience, where you have natural strengths and built-in advantages, where you might already have a network. There's lots of reasons a particular channel might work for a particular show. And so what I would want to dive into is, let's think about how people can actually maybe figure out which channel's best for them, which things they can try outside of, I'm going to grow an Instagram account to 3 million or whatever. Sure, maybe that would help, but a lot of the people listening don't have big social media followings. So what can they do to grow their show?
Yeah. So there's essentially 3 ways to acquire new customers, or in our case, listeners. So this is kind of the 3 listener acquisition channels that we're going to call them, which is owned, earned, and paid. And so you want to run us through some examples of each of those categories?
Sure. So under owned, that would be like traffic to your podcast website. There's also your own newsletter and email list, right? And also, if you have a big social media following, like we talked about last week, of course, that would be owned. You have a bunch of followers, and you can leverage that to get more listeners.
And essentially, like when we're talking about owned, this is like you have built the audience and have some kind of access to them elsewhere. It's not like you're needing to go out and get in front of new people. And so this is probably your warmest audience a lot of times on a platform that you own. Social media is a little bit funny in this category because they may throttle back your reach and things like that, but I still lump it into the owned category typically.
Totally. I think earned is really interesting. Earned is where you kind of like earn the right to access that channel. So for example, collaborations and cross promotions, these are all things you have to work at.
Yeah.
You have to build some relationships. There's PR, so traditional PR, and then also doing PR in newsletters, and then podcast app pitching, like we were talking about before.
Yeah.
So I really like these, though, the earned category, because I think a lot of people aren't willing to put in the work.
Yeah. And we're going to talk more about some of the specifics related to earned and some of those tactics that you can use within that category. But before we do that, let's just kind of quickly summarize paid acquisition. We're going to talk more about this, but what are some examples of ways that people could use their budget to get their show in front of more people potentially?
Yeah, this would be in-app ads in podcast listening apps. This would be advertising on other shows. This would be paid social advertising or integrations or partnerships, paid ads on Google. So anytime you're paying to get some listener interest or a subscriber.
Yeah. And I know that you have a kind of case study here about the benefits and or trials and tribulations of paid advertising. We're going to save that, come back to that when we talk about paid advertising in more depth. But the first one that I want to just kind of circle back on, we're going to go through these in a little bit more depth now that we've kind of defined them. But I think that owned media is a really interesting listener acquisition channel that people often forget about. And so again, this is things that platforms that you already own. And one of the things that, like, not everybody has a ton of website traffic, not everybody has a huge email list, but I have talked to a significant number of people who have, maybe they get 25 or 50,000 homepage views of their website a month, or they have an email list of 25,000 people, and yet they're getting 100 or 50 downloads an episode.
Yeah.
And to me, this is always the first thing I say is like, hey, you're like trying to worry about like paid advertising and all the stuff. Like, we have all this attention in your ecosystem that we can design this experience here. Like, this is the low-hanging fruit here. And maybe redesigning that website homepage, maybe thinking a little bit more strategically about your maybe newsletter welcome sequence and what you're sending on a week-to-week basis. Like, there's a lot of growth here. If you've got people already engaging with you in some way, they've indicated, hey, I like your content in some other medium. And that's not to say everybody's going to, want to become a podcast listener at some point, but it seems unlikely to me that many people would explicitly not want to listen to the podcast. That if you're only capturing like 2% of that audience is converting into podcast listeners, it feels like, okay, I think there's more that we can do here.
I know this happened, for example, with Firefox and Mozilla. They had a podcast. People are already visiting the Firefox homepage. And I believe it was Dan Meisner that told me this. He said the first thing he recommended is, he said, you have all these fans that are already visiting the Mozilla homepage. Put your podcast there. Yeah. These are people that already like you. And then the podcast can do the work that it's already good at, which is deepening that connection with that audience. I think this is underrated, especially for branded podcasts, especially for folks who have been blogging for years. You can do this today and get a bunch more listeners. There's all these spots in your existing ecosystem. You can put the podcast there, and the people who love you are going to seek that out, and you'll be able to deepen that connection with them. Yeah.
And I think that one of the things that is the kind of crux of the issue here, when you have an audience that isn't listening to the podcast, you need to try a bunch of angles. And that's the challenge here, is finding the angle in which to present the podcast that gets this existing audience who already cares about your topic, but isn't listening to the show. Is it that they think they're just already getting the same thing through your newsletter, let's say, or your blog on your website? And they're like, well, why would I listen to the podcast? Like, I already get this here. And there are certainly shows where I have that perspective. I'm like, I love the newsletter, never going to listen to the podcast because they're basically the same thing. And I can read the newsletter in 3 minutes versus listen to a 20-minute podcast.
Yeah.
But that might not actually be the case. Maybe the podcast is very different from the experience that they get elsewhere. And that means that your job is to actually highlight, here's how we do this differently. Like, you get one experience in the newsletter, but we do this whole other thing on the podcast that really complements this, and being able to, over time, find that angle and the way that's going to get people to migrate from one platform to the other.
Yeah. And I can give you an example of another kind of owned channel, which is search traffic. People are searching things on Google, especially, but now increasingly YouTube, and even on Spotify and Apple. People are putting topical searches in those search bars. And maybe I'll shout out Famous and Gravy. That's Michael and Amit, I believe.
Yep.
And I'm going to shout them out partly because they shared our podcast on Threads, actually.
Oh.
Big podcast community on Threads right now. And I think their show has just tons of opportunity for search traffic.
Yeah.
So Famous and Gravy is a podcast about life lessons from dead celebrities. Okay. So instantly they've got some important keywords. And when I put their website into an SEO tool like Ahrefs, I can see, for example, one of the number one keywords to their website right now is Burt Reynolds mustache, right? And they're getting those search results right now just because the episode title is I think it's like Beyond the Mustache or something like that. But on that landing page for that episode, on the episode page, they could highlight other parts of the episode, and they could do it in a question answer format. You know, whatever happened to Burt Reynolds? Is Burt Reynolds alive? What was so great about Burt Reynolds' mustache? And they could take out little highlights from the show, either from their transcript or even little audio snippets, and they're going to rank higher for those kind of keywords. If someone is interested in the life and then death of Burt Reynolds, they could find this podcast and become a listener.
Yeah. So owned media, I think that there is a lot of big opportunity there for a lot of people. Usually the people who have those opportunities have been creating either a business or some kind of content, maybe outside their podcast for a while, that they've accrued this audience elsewhere. And so this is not going to be applicable or available to everyone, at least at the start. Hopefully it does. And for almost everybody, it will become a more important part of your strategy over time. But let's move on to the kind of earned side of things. And specifically, let's talk about collaborations. And this is certainly something that works in podcasting. And a lot of people are getting on the bandwagon recently, but I don't know that they're always kind of taking the best approach.
Yeah, I think the challenge with this category is people hear about it like, oh, like collaborations or guesting on other podcasts. And they're like, okay, I need to hire an agency that's going to, cold email pitch me to thousands of podcasts. And I think the approach that you want to take here is more networking, friendships. Every niche has its own like group, its own tribe, and they're all like doing collabs all the time. They've realized there's reach here, and it works a lot better if you're friends with these people. That's the kind of collaboration I think more people should be cultivating.
Yeah. And I think to illustrate the approach that a lot of people take, this is an extreme example. It's a friend of mine, and he has a podcast in the real estate space. And at some point about 2 years ago, he guested on something like 70 shows. And he said, basically, it had zero impact. He said one show moved the needle that brought in new listeners to his show, and everything else was a total waste of time. And I asked him like, oh, like, really? How did that work? He's like, yeah, well, I kind of basically just guessed on any show that would have me and took a kind of spray and pray approach, and, one and done. And that was it. He's like, yeah, I should have known that wouldn't have worked, but, I thought it was worth a shot. And I think if I was to allocate that time into something related to collaborations, personally, if I'm focusing on guesting, I would really research 5 to 10 shows. And I'm going to say, okay, like any one of these would really move the needle for me. I don't need to get on all of them, but just if I could get on one that's a big show, that's going to be much more effective. And so I'm going to listen through 5 episodes, and I'm going to find out like, what is my unique angle to this show? Like, why am I a good fit for this show? Because if I'm not, I can't make a pitch that's going to get me on there. And even if I do, if I don't have a unique angle, people aren't going to follow me back to my show. And so that is part of the research. It's not just the pitch, but actually the discernment of like, where do you have something unique and refreshing to offer to this audience? And this is true for guesting. It's also true for collaborations.
Totally. And this is where being a fan of the type of content that you're making really helps. You can kind of stair-step your way into some of this as well. When the host of another show that you like asks for feedback, hit them up with some feedback. When they say, here's our voicemail, leave a voice message. Yeah. When they say, hey, everybody who replies to this tweet, we're going to try to highlight you in the next episode, reply to that tweet. And eventually the hosts start to discover who the super fans of their show are. And eventually I've had that lead to, I started out as a fan and then got mentioned on the show. And I mean, that's huge, right? Mentioning someone on the show. And then eventually got up to being a guest on the show.
Yeah. And I would say two things on that note. It actually often happens way faster than you think. This is less likely if they're like they've got millions of followers or something like that, and they really need to screen all of that. But people who are a little bit ahead of you in your space and are very closely aligned, often if you comment on their posts on, let's just say, social media, or respond to, 3 of their newsletters in a row or something like that, that's often enough for them to be like, oh, this person like is really interested in what I'm doing. And I've had so many examples of sending a thoughtful, heartfelt message DM to somebody where the one time I did this to a startup founder, to their support chat, and it was like a bootstrapped indie startup. It's kind of a time tracking freelancery type thing. And they had all these Seinfeld references where all their like email, like blank state fields and things like that. And I just like said, man, I love this app and I love all the Seinfeld references. Like, keep doing what you're doing. And he responded to me and he was like, dude, you have no idea how much I needed to hear that today. It's been a really rough go. And like, we don't really know where the future of the app is going. And like, he kind of said like, this has been so meaningful to me. And I almost didn't send that. And it took me, 5 minutes to write. And that was years and years ago. And it's always stuck with me what one simple DM message, the impact it can have on someone and the relationship that it can form from that. And I think, we all have that potential every single day to do that. And so it's not like you need to go out there and do that to 100 people a day. Like, do it to one person a week and amazing things will happen over the next year.
Again, most people aren't willing to put in the work here.
Mm-hmm.
Ask not what Tim Ferriss can do for you. Ask what you can do for Tim Ferriss. The other day, I was listening to a show and there's this one segment. I'm like, oh, that would be an awesome thing to share on social media for them. So I got home, downloaded the YouTube video off the internet, clipped the show, posted it on Twitter and Threads and other places. And the host messaged me and said, thank you so much for doing that for us. You just did all of this work for us. And I appreciate it so much. That's how you build relationships. You don't say, oh, how can this podcast help grow my show? The first stage is saying, how can I be helpful?
Yeah. I think the thing to kind of close out this conversation, maybe on collaborations, is that you get much more out of aiming small and building a kind of repeat group of collaborators. And you get to this point where, let's say like you in your niche, your industry, however you want to define the space, if you think like, okay, I'm going to be active here over the next, 2, 3, 5, 10 years. And the really beautiful thing that happens when you commit to building relationships is now you grow this group of, 30 or 50 people who start shouting you out regardless of any transactional value. They're just like, oh, my friend Justin posted this thing. I thought it was really cool. My audience should know about it as well.
Yeah.
And you start to get this compounding effect where now you just have this group of friends who you're all just sharing each other's stuff because it's beneficial and you think it's cool. And I think like that's the point when collaborations really ramp up in value, but it's not like a quick fix. But if you stick with it, like it will be transformative for your marketing and your show.
Totally.
All right. So let's move on to the final kind of deep dive of one of the marketing channels here that I know is on a lot of people's minds. A lot of people think, if there's anything that is the silver bullet, it is paid acquisition, paid advertising on podcast apps, on other shows, on Facebook or Google or wherever else. I hear so many people, and this was actually in the report, in the survey, one of the things that I asked was like, what is the biggest frustration that you have when it comes to marketing? And so many people said, I don't have the budget to spend on ads. And I thought, I don't know that that advertising is really the cure-all that you think it is going to be. Have you had any experience advertising with Transistor or your own projects in the past, or what has that been like?
Yeah, I mean, on Transistor side, it's actually cracking paid acquisition is difficult.
Yeah.
It's hard, and we haven't really found a good paid acquisition channel that works well all the time. And we've also seen this reflected with our customers and the customer research we've done. I pulled this anecdote from Reddit. They did an Overcast ad, which is one of those places where you can, pay to have an ad appear in Overcast. So people are listening to shows in that category. And then there's an ad where people can instantly listen and subscribe. So they say they did it for 30 days. They got about 240,000 people saw the ad. Quite a bit.
Yeah,
you think, wow,
pretty good.
We're killing it here. Only about 1,800 people clicked on the ad. Guess how many new subscribers they got?
1,800 people clicked out of 240,000 impressions. That's right. Okay, 240,000, 1,800. I'm going to guess something like maybe they got 200 new subscribers.
72 people
Ooh.
subscribe to the show. Guess how much that cost them? $6 per subscriber. So in order to get 72 new people subscribe to the show, and we have no idea, did they stick around?
Right.
We don't know any of that.
Mhm.
$6 is a lot of money to be paying to acquire one subscriber. I would say that's not scalable. That's not repeatable. I would not do that experiment again if it was costing you that much, right?
Yeah. So I want to bring in some context here. And so this is a very broadly generic type of calculation we're doing here. But at a $20 CPM rate, which is, roughly kind of similar, a good benchmark for advertising that a lot of shows run on. And a lot of people want to get sponsors for their show, get paid a CPM rate. So $20 per 1,000 impressions. Each impression is worth 2 cents. So you can start to do the math and you can think, okay, well, how many impressions do I need to get to pay off that $6 that I paid to acquire that listener? So essentially doing the math here, in order to pay back that $6 that you spent to acquire that listener, you need to deliver 300 ad impressions to them. And so if you think, okay, if you do 3 ads an episode, if you can even fill that for your show, get 3 sponsors paying at that $20 CPM, you'd need to do 100 episodes to pay off that listener. And as we've kind of seen from some of the churn data in Chartable and elsewhere, it is not likely that most listeners actually stick around that long. Then you have to factor this in. Your actual cost per engaged long-term subscriber is probably way, way higher. It's probably, $30, $40, $50 per subscriber. And it could even be more. And I've seen a lot of data around podcast advertising that consistently brings back like cost per subscriber acquisition at anywhere from, $10 up to multiple hundreds of dollars. And so this is something that I think people think, if I could just pay to get my show in front of people, I'd have this instant flood of listeners. Usually I would not recommend it unless you have a way to both recoup your cost that is proven, and you can track that and attribute that. And you can say, okay, I know for a fact that for every 100 listeners that I get back to the show, I make back at least my money, if not more. And if you don't have that, which is very difficult in podcasting, I think it is likely that you are throwing a lot of money away. And usually when advertising works well for a lot of smaller businesses and creators, it's like you have a high ticket product that you only need to sell 1 to every 1,000 people. And so it's going to pay off. And if you have a proven conversion system, your podcast converts people into customers, that is when I would start to maybe think about it. But even then, I would be much more inclined to actually advertise to get people onto my email list, because typically you can get email subscribers for, $2 or less. And now they're on your email list, and now you can actually promote the podcast to them from the email, like in the welcome sequence, in your ongoing email communications. You already want them on your email list to be able to sell them on your product or service. And so you kind of need to get them there anyway, and it's cheaper, lower friction to do so.
Yeah.
So that, if you're going to pay to advertise, that is probably what I would do instead. And it's actually interesting. I was talking with somebody who works in marketing at one of the big podcast networks just a couple of weeks ago. And they told me that across the whole network, they basically canceled all ad spend on listener acquisition. It was that it just didn't work, and it was not worth the spend that they were doing. And they kind of said, like, we're just doubling down on cross promotions between our shows and also doing cross promotions with shows outside the network. And so they were going for that, using the leverage they have as a big, well-known network to be able to line up cross promotions, collaborations, guesting, all that kind of stuff elsewhere.
There you go. There you go. It's back to things that don't scale. Do things that don't scale. There's no silver bullet, and spending money on ads is probably not going to solve your growth problem.
Yeah. So I think we've talked a lot about some of the channels to acquire new listeners. And I think one of the things that we both really believe strongly about podcasting, we've talked about this in previous episodes, is still the biggest way that shows grow is word of mouth. And the reason we did this episode is because to kickstart word of mouth growth, you need to get some people in there initially. And not every single person who becomes a listener is going to become an advocate for the show. So you probably need a base of, 500, 1,000 people before you really start to see any kind of word of mouth growth. The show also has to be noteworthy and remarkable enough to talk about. But one of the things that we want to end on here is thinking about, okay, once you start getting to this point where you are attracting people into the show, you have a kind of base, how do you then kind of convert that audience into advocates and get them to start doing more of that, talking about the show, promoting it for you?
Yeah. One thing we talked about before is rewarding the behavior you want to see more of. So if people are shouting you out on Twitter, or LinkedIn, mention them on the show. Say, hey, thanks so much to Podcast Allies for shouting out our show.
Yeah.
They had a really nice write-up in their newsletter, and we appreciate it.
Yeah.
Do things like that. Have regular shout-outs for people that are helping to spread the show. Reward the behavior you want to see more of. This could also be highlighting reviews, tweets, blog posts. Blog post links are especially underrated. So if somebody, for example, wrote about you, Tina highlighted her 10 favorite real estate podcasts that you should listen to in 2024. Those lists are amazing. And if somebody does that for you, thank them. Say, thanks so much for writing that post about us. And that will encourage other people who are your fans to do that for you too.
Yeah. That phrase, reward the behavior you want to see more of, was kind of a light bulb moment for me when I heard it years ago. And it was something that in my old newsletter, Creative Wayfinding, when it was small, one of the things that I very intentionally did was at the top of every newsletter, so right beneath the masthead, every single issue, I would go through and I would link to everybody who had kind of commented with a nice comment or shared something on Twitter. That could be just a Twitter post that they retweeted or something about the newsletter. And I shouted out, I made sure everybody could see it. First thing up top, that like, hey, here's all the people who are supporting me in some way, and I want to give you some backlinks as well. And it was really interesting that a lot of people commented on that over time. And like, part of it was strategic. I was like, I do want to encourage more of this, but part of it was like, this was a newsletter for creatives and creators. And so everybody was working on cool stuff who was a part of my newsletter. And I was like, I do genuinely also want more people to know about all these other awesome people. And it was something that like, the more I did it, the more I got. And like, there were some weeks where there was lulls and there wasn't that much to shout out. But for the most part, there was dozens of things that I could promote other people for each and every week. And the thing that I really did is I went out of my way to find stuff. I was like, I want to reward the tiniest little action of somebody supporting me. It doesn't need to be a huge thing. And so this is something that it does work, and it becomes this flywheel that the more you do it, the more you get. And that can really seed some of the buzz around your show, create more conversation around it out in public, which ultimately attracts more people to it.
Totally.
I think one of the best, it's a little bit unattainable for most people, but My First Million did this, where they did a kind of clip contest where they made the video for their podcast freely available and encouraged their listeners to chop it up into engaging TikTok clips. And they offered, I think it was like a $10,000 reward. Like every month they gave away a $10,000 prize to like the best one, the one that got the most views, I think it was. And so again, this isn't something that everybody can do, but astute listeners might recognize that we have something similar going on with this show, where, we both genuinely do like roasting podcasts and helping other people out in that sense. But also, it is a way for us to get people to leave ratings and reviews for the show, which helps us, and people can submit their shows that way. And we've just got some amazing ratings and reviews so far, both that are just like really nice things that people said, and also then submitting their shows. And so it really feels like a win-win for everybody. And there is this kind of feedback loop where like, hey, we get to create more content that not only helps that person, but also helps everybody who watches that roast and can say, oh, that actually applies to my show as well. And also, our show now benefits from more ratings and reviews as well. So there's a kind of flywheel that we've kind of built in somewhat intentionally, somewhat accidentally, out of hey, this would be cool if we did that. How do we get people to submit it? Oh, what if they left a review to do it?
There's all sorts of ways you can do this. And a lot of it will come up organically as you're in the show, recording the show. Think about, oh, what's a recurring bit that would be kind of fun for us and the listeners that might create this flywheel effect that we're talking about.
Yeah. So I think we've pretty exhaustively covered a lot of the listener acquisition channels here. What would you kind of like leave people with when it comes to thinking about where they are going out and kind of building their own discovery engines for their shows?
To me, the opportunity is in cultivating a network. I think people don't immediately think about that when it comes to marketing, but that's actually one of the highest leverage activities you can do is build relationships with other people.
I think this has maybe been your advice on every episode so far, the closing advice. And I think that actually it's probably worth drilling that in each and every episode, because I think it's just true. And I think you and I have both benefited from that in our careers, and our content has been so community driven and network driven, where we have just made friends with people whose work we admired. And this has just been like how every great collaboration for me has ever happened, is that I meet someone and I'm like, man, they're cool, and I really want to do something with them, and I have no idea on what it is. And then, 6 months or a year or 2 years or 3 years go by and the perfect thing comes into place at the right moment. And you're like, "Oh, I'm so glad I met that person 3 years ago and actually like took the time to nurture that relationship."
Absolutely. And these relationships also amplify all of these other channels we talked about.
Yeah.
So it's an accelerant to have these relationships.
So I think if there's one thing that I would leave people with after this episode on the topic of relationships, we've talked about a bunch of different listener acquisition channels. So I would say, if there's one that stands out to you that like, especially if you have a ton of website traffic or email lists that you haven't converted into podcast listeners, like focus on that. But on the topic of relationships, what I would really recommend that people do here is you've probably got somebody in your mind that you would love to collaborate with someday in the future. What I would recommend you do right now is go to whatever social platform that you are connected with that person on or you follow them on and send them a message, and just it's pure appreciation. There is no ask. There is nothing that you are hoping that they will give you. It's just you sending them a message saying, "Hey, I've never messaged you before, but I've always really admired your work. And I just, want you to know how much I appreciate the work that you do." Send that message today. And who knows, like maybe a conversation comes out of this and you have a little back and forth and maybe that dies out after that. That's fine. And you kind of have to be okay with expecting that, most of these things are going to go that way. But in my experience, so often it's that seed is planted early on, that then they start to recognize you more when you comment on their stuff in social. And over time, over a few months, perhaps you start to actually develop more of a relationship. And maybe it doesn't, not everyone will, but a few of those will. And I think it always starts with just like sending a message, letting people know that you appreciate your work, and really incredible things can come out of that tiny act.
Agreed. And if you end up doing any of that, if you end up trying any of that, let us know. We'd love to hear how you're exploring some of this material, how you're experimenting with your own show. That wraps it up for this episode. If you want to check out the full report that we've been talking about, go to podcastmarketingtrends.com/2023.